با سلام و درود خدمت رفقای گل و دنبال کنندگان کانال دکتر ژئوپلتیک، پویا داوری هستم با یک برنامه دیگه از مرشایمر. اول که ببینیم که آقای مرشایمر کیه. ایشون یه استاد برجسته علوم سیاسی تو دانشگاه شیکاگوه و خیلی لازمه که ما این آدمو بشناسیم اگر که علاقه‌مندیم به مسائل روابط بین‌الملل و نقطه نگاه این آدم رو اگر که دقت کرده باشید ما در این کانال بهش خیلی میپردازیم. یکی از نظریه پردازان مشهور روابط بین الملل و از چهره‌های پیشرو در مکتب رئالیسم تهاجمی ایشون، آفنسیو رئالیسم. ایشون در آثار خودش بر این ایده تاکید داره که نظام بین الملل ذاتاً هرج و مرج‌آمیزه، یعنی فاقد یک اقتدار و یک قدرت مرکزی مثل یک کشور که حکومت مرکزی داره هست، یعنی حکومت مرکزی که دنیا رو کنترل کنه و یک ارتش واحد باشه نداره و دولت‌ها برای تضمین بقای خود همواره در تلاشن تا قدرت خودشون رو به حداکثر برسونن و بر رقیبشون تسلط پیدا کنن. مهمترین ایده ها و نظریات مرشایمر چیه؟ رئالیست تهاجمی. در کتاب مشهورش به نام تراژدی سیاست قدرت‌های بزرگ که سال 2001 چاپ کرده استدلال میکنه که قدرت‌های بزرگ به دلیل ساختار آنارشیک نظام بین‌الملل ناگزیر به رقابت برای هژمونی منطقه‌ای هستند و همکاری‌های پایدار میان آنها دشواره. یعنی چی؟ یعنی دنیا یک بی‌نظمی هموارگی رو داره و اصلا سگ صاحبش رو نمیشناسه و نمیشه روی هیچ کسی پایدار و دائمی حساب کرد. پس باید همیشه خودتو بکشونی بالا. دوم، انتقاد به گسترش ناتو به شرق داره مرشایمر هشدار میده که گسترش ناتو به سوی کشورهای اروپای شرقی مانند اوکراین موجب تنش با روسیه و احتمال درگیری اونها میشد که امروز ما شاهدیم که شد. همواره مرشایمر به این موضوع تاکید داشت آقا آخر سر ما منجر به جنگ میشه این حرکات تهاجمی که میکنیم. اون تو سال 2004 بحران اوکراین یکی از این مسائل دونست که ما پیامدش امروز توی جنگ هم 3 ساله داریم میبینیم. یکی دیگه از مسائلی که مرشایمر بهش پردازه چالش چین برای هژمونی آمریکاست. معتقد مرشایمر که رشد قدرت چین به طور اجتناب ناپذیری به تقابل با ایالات متحده منجر میشه، زیرا چین به دنبال هژمونی منطقه‌ای تو آسیاست و کاهش نفوذ آمریکا. پس اتومات اینا با هم برخورد دارن. مواضع جنجالی داره واسه جهان مرشایمر، از جمله به دلیل تحلیل‌های واقع گرایانه‌ای که داره گاهی منتقدانه از سیاست‌های خارجی آمریکا خیلی تند انتقاد میکنه. به ویژه در قبال اسرائیل مرشایمر از منتقدان شدید نقش لابی اسرائیل تو ایالات متحده است. میگه این لابیای سیاسی اسرائیل تو واشنگتن خیلی قدرتمنده و بیش از این که به منافع آمریکا بپردازن آمریکایی‌ها، سیاستمداراشون به اسرائیل میپردازن و این موضوع خیلی مورد توجه قرار گرفته. انتقادهای مرشایمر در این مورد. ایشون مرشایمر دکترای خودش رو تو دانشگاه کانال دریافت کرده و از 1980 یعنی 44 سال پیش تو دانشگاه شیکاگو تدریس میکنه و تقریبا شهیرترین استاد روابط بین‌الملل حال حاضر جهان هستش و نظریاتش تاثیر عمیقی بر مطالعات امنیتی جهان و مطالعات استراتژیک معاصر داشته. بریم صحبت‌های این دفعه مرشایمر رو با هم داشته باشیم.
لطفاً کانال ما رو سابسکرایب و با لایک و کامنت و اشتراک گذاری کلیپ ها از ما حمایت کنید. سپاسگزاریم.
Hard power realities on the ground. In other words, Hexit understands, the Trump administration understands we have lost. We have lost this war. The tide has turned against Ukraine and the West. The problem is that huge numbers of people in the West don't understand that. They operate under this illusion that Ukraine is doing fine and all we have to do is give them a bit more weaponry and fine-tune the fighting machine and they'll stymie the Russians and eventually roll them back. And if you think like that about the situation on the ground, then obviously you're not going to like this deal at all. But if you face reality, which is what Hexit and Trump and company are doing, then it's obvious you have no choice here but to end the war. On favorable terms, if you can. So, again, I think the Hexit speech, when you look at it, is a really quite remarkable document. The number of things that he says in very clear terms that are quite profound. You should agree with them. I happen to agree with them. But the things that he says that are quite profound, quite explicit, are really amazing. And I think the Trump administration will build on what Hexit said. I think that's the foundation. I think they sent him out on purpose to make that set of arguments. Second point, just about multipolarity. I think what's going on here is that the United States wants to pivot to Asia. And it understands that if you pivot to someplace, you have to pivot from someplace. And they want to pivot from Europe and go to Asia. I think that they'd like to pivot from the Middle East as well and put an end to that. But it's much more difficult because of the Israel lobby in the United States to pivot in any meaningful way from the Middle East. But Europe, you can pivot from. And I think what's happening here is that the Trump administration wants to have good relations with the Russians and, in effect, peel the Russians away from the Chinese. I think that the Trump administration is trying to do what the Nixon administration did when it changed our relationship with China because we didn't like the idea of China and the Soviet Union being the best of friends and us being on the other side of the fence. We brought the Chinese to our side of the fence. I think in this case, what Trump and company are trying to do is bring the Russians over to our side of the fence and put some daylight. Doesn't mean that the Russians and the Americans are going to be bosom buddies or allies or anything like that. But I think that the Trump administration wants to put some daylight between China and Russia, wants to get us out of Europe as much as possible and let us concentrate on East Asia. I want to go back to the Machiavelli quote that you started with, Glenn. I think one of the principal reasons that we're in so much trouble today, we meaning the West, is that we don't pay attention to what I would call brute facts. We fail to recognize brute facts. And we fail to think rationally and logically about all sorts of issues. And what's happened is we've created this sort of ideological straitjacket that if you don't fit into it, you're pushed completely out of the discourse, the mainstream discourse. It's really kind of bizarre. And J.D. Vance was making this point in Munich when he said that, it's a lot like the Soviet Union used to be here in Europe, right? There's this ideological straitjacket. So that people like us who have been arguing against the conventional wisdom for a long, long time, and I do believe we emphasize brute facts and logic. This is not to say we're always right. We've all been wrong on a number of issues. That just goes with the territory. But we're concentrating on the brute facts and we're trying to be as logical as possible. But because we come to conclusions that are outside the ideological straitjacket, you're basically ruled out of court. You're not part of the discourse. So we have this huge number of people in the West who are thinking about Ukraine based on faulty logic and a misunderstanding of the facts. And in those sorts of circumstances, it's no surprise that you're in this disastrous situation. If people had paid serious attention to the facts and had thought logically, we would have shut this war down a good year and a half ago. And it would have been to Ukraine's advantage. And this argument that Ukraine is not losing on the battlefield, it can turn the tide, has nothing to do with facts and logic. And pursuing policies based on that set of facts is destined to do even more damage to Ukraine. So I just think it's very important, especially when you're dealing with national security issues, for people to be brutally honest about what's going on, whether they like it or not. You just, if you want to be a good strategist, you want to think about what's best for your country. Sort of basic intellectual integrity is essential. And I think intellectual integrity has suffered enormous damage since the Cold War ended in 1989. And that's in good part why we're in so much trouble today.
لطفاً کانال ما رو سابسکرایب و با لایک و کامنت و اشتراک گذاری کلیپ ها از ما حمایت کنید. سپاسگزاریم.